Hello all, in this video I'll be making another hook and ring toss game. If you came here to find out why I'm moving away from polyurethane finishes, don't worry, it wasn't a clickbait title. I will address that later in the video and I'll have it marked as a chapter if you'd like to skip to that point. To get this game started, I obviously had to pick out some wood, and the customer wanted a darker wood with lots of character, so I went with a figured black walnut. I also utilized a manzanita branch with a lot of character, which you'll see later. For now, what I'm doing is basically breaking down and milling the lumber. I don't have a jointer, so I tend to mostly just use my router sled for flattening wood. I didn't do the best job of recording everything for this game, so if you're interested in the number of pieces and dimensions for this build, I'll be adding that to the description. For the base of the game, I aim for a thickness of about 1.5 inches, and this can be less if I use a very dense wood, but the idea is to have a nice sturdy base so that there's no risk of the game falling or even wobbling. I should probably invest in a glue roller because this is kind of a lot of wood to cover in glue using just my finger. Next up is drilling the holes in the token board to accept the token. This is actually the second token board for this game because when I started drilling the first, the Forstner bit got dull enough to start poorly cutting, which allowed the wood to move around enough in that hole and it became ugly, not perfectly circular. So I sharpened the Forstner bit, milled up a new piece of walnut for the token board, and started drilling again. In the past, I've just used black CA glue to hold the magnets in place, but the success of that is kind of hit and miss. I spray the CA glue with the accelerator, but that just seems to cure the surface, so when I go to sand down the glue to be flush with the wood, the uncured glue can become exposed and gunk up the sandpaper. Also, using the accelerator seems to sometimes cause bubbles under the surface, which can just cause more work. If I don't use the accelerator at all, the CA glue could take a couple weeks to cure completely, so I've moved on to a 2-part epoxy with a black tint. In case you're wondering why you see 2 different token boards here, that's because I'm working on 2 games at once and filming them both at the same time because I'm doing this step at the same time. Once the epoxy is cured, it needs to be sanded flush with the wood, and the wood usually just needs to be sanded anyway. I generally don't record sanding because it's terrible and it's a pretty well understood process. However, I wanted to share how horrible sanding inside of these holes is. In case you're wondering why I'm doing this by hand and not using a rotary tool, it's because the rotary tool will sand against the grain and make it far too easy to screw up the flatness of the bottom of the hole. It's also worth noting that this part of the video was recorded in time-lapse and I still ended up doubling the playback rate. Now I'm just putting a chamfer on all of the edges that won't be resting on a table. Sorry for my shoddy camera work, I didn't realize the camera was moving around so much while recording. These blobs of black are blanks for tokens for these games. That's also very difficult to say. What I did was put a block of manzanita in a Ziploc bag with some tinted deep pour epoxy. The reason I did this is because manzanita splits a lot as it dries, so I fill those cracks with epoxy to make a lot of it usable. Removing the Ziploc looks like a pain, but it's kind of nice doing a mindless task that has no risk of ruining the project. This next part is a little sketchy, but what I'm doing is lopping off the ends of the blank so that I have flat-ish ends I can stick between centers on the lathe and make a nice cylinder. There are a lot more experienced wood turners you can watch for this info, but we've got time. So one thing I'd like to point out is that when you turn something between centers on the lathe, you want to make sure to stop and tighten up the tailstock periodically. If you don't, that wood can compress a little, which allows it to wobble around, and best case scenario is that you just have a hard time maintaining concentricity. Worst case scenario is that it comes off the lathe and smacks you in the face. With a mostly uniform cylinder, I can cut the ends to be mostly parallel to each other so that when I drill a hole to put it on the screw chuck, it seats nicely in the screw chuck and runs close to true on the lathe, resulting in less material that needs to be removed to make it concentric again. If I hadn't cut the ends to be mostly parallel prior to drilling that pilot hole, turning the lathe on would most likely result in the blank spinning all wobbly instead of nice and straight like you see here. Now I can start getting the blank down to its final diameter and turning the shape I'd like it to have. For the shape, I basically just remove some material in the center so it's not a boring cylinder of wood. I think this also makes grabbing it from the top a tad easier. For the dimensions, I think all that really matters is that the base fits nicely in the holes of the token board. Kind of like a certain adult activity. You don't want it to fit so tightly that you struggle to get it in the hole, but you also don't want it to fit so loosely that there's no point in having the hole. Once I get the token off the lathe, I expand the pilot hole to accept the magnet. The way I expand the hole is to simply use the appropriate sized drill bit and drill very slowly. Drilling very slowly basically allows the bit to find center on its own. Now I need to glue in the magnet, but first I need to make sure the magnet is at the appropriate depth. If the magnet is too close to the surface, it'll pick up the token board, which is bad. If it's not close enough, then you won't really notice the magnets working, which defeats the purpose of the magnets. So I add in a little cylindrical foam to act as a spacer between the magnet and the surface. With the magnet and the spacer in place, I can fill that void with CA glue to permanently hold it all in place. First, I use a thin CA glue to make sure I get some good penetration, and then I fill near the surface with the medium CA glue. Once that's had a little time to cure, I just sand it flush and do a quick test. The last step for the token is to flock the bottom. For this, I take the cheap route, which might actually be better. What I do is I get a layer of wood glue where I want the flocking and then drop the flocking onto the glue. I let the glue dry for an hour or more and then blast it with an air compressor to remove any loose flocking. I repeat this process until the underside of the token looks and feels the way I want it to. I say that this might be the better option because the way the flocking companies recommend doing it is to use a flocking specific glue which matches the color of the flock you're using. This seems like a nice idea because there's no risk of seeing the wood through the flock, but then the flock wouldn't be as thick and nice feeling. I suppose you could just use 2 or more layers of their colored glue, but this works perfectly, so it just seems like a waste of money to buy their colored glue. Now we're onto the post. I make the post for my games out of manzanita branches because they have a lot of character, which I think looks really cool and allows for another way to make my hook and ring toss games unique. The first step in turning a branch into a post is to clean up the branch with a wire wheel, and you can see me do some of that process in a short on my channel called Manzanita Branches for Woodworking, but here we're just going to skip straight to the second step, which is to cut the ends to be the right length and to cut them to be perfectly parallel to each other. Doing this helps to make sure that the top of the game is parallel to the bottom. An important part of this step is lining up the post. I have a center line in the jig that holds the post, and I do my best to make sure that the top and bottom of the post are on that center line. This helps to make sure that the post is as perpendicular to the top and the base as it can be. The less perpendicular it is to those surfaces, the more unfair the game will be for one side, because the branch will be more in the way of the ring on that side. This jig is the best way I know to cut the ends safely and perfectly parallel to each other, but as you can see, it takes some finessing. With the branch securely in place, I make the cuts very slowly on the miter saw so that the blade is only cutting through the wood and not pushing down on the wood. I also move the jig from one side to the other to make the cuts rather than spinning the jig around because the jig isn't perfectly straight. Keeping the same side of the jig against the fence ensures that the same exact angle is cut on both sides of the post. Now that all the pieces are prepped, I can figure out where exactly to put the post. The way I do this is to find the center point of the board and place the post in a position that will put the center of the post 3.5 inches above the base at the center of the board. If you put the center of the bottom of the post in the center of the board and the post is curvy, then the point where the hooks attached to the post won't be in the center of the board. With the location of the post determined, I can drill a hole through the base for a screw to go through. I like to use a screw plus wood glue to secure the post to the base so that I can use just the screw to temporarily hold the two together while aligning everything else. It also makes the glue up a bit easier, and I think it just makes it a little bit more structurally sound in the long run. With the hole drilled through the base, I can use double-sided tape to temporarily attach the post to the base and drill the pilot hole for the screw into the post through the base. Or more accurately, just start the hole by drilling through the base since my drill bit isn't long enough to drill the full length of the hole in the post while passing through the base. I'm not sure if the video you're seeing now is the first or second hole, but I actually had to do this twice. There are 2 holes in the bottom of the base, which I eventually plug rather than one. This is because the placement of my first screw was off by enough that it busted through the branch. Fortunately, I was able to glue that piece that broke off back on, but it meant that the whole placement had to be moved so the screw would have enough meat to securely hold the post. This part is explained in more detail in a prior video, but basically what I'm doing is aligning the top to be centered over the base. The way that I do this is by creating some spacers that are half the difference between the dimensions of the 2 pieces. The spacer between the bottom of the game and the wall pushes its center out to where the center of the top of the game is when the top of the game is touching the wall. The spacers under the top of the game lift its center up to where the center of the base of the game is. In order for all of that to work, the base of the game needs to be perpendicular to the surface it's resting on as well as the wall that the spacer is touching. That's why you see me fiddling so much with the square. Once the base is correctly configured, I can set the top onto its spacers and squeeze it all together with a clamp. The purpose of this is reliant on a little pin that I have taped to the top of the post. When it's all squeezed together, this makes an indentation on the underside of the top of the game as well as the top of the post. This allows me to drill exactly where I need to so that both pieces can accept the dowel, which will result in the top being aligned with the bottom once it's all glued up. Drilling these holes seems fairly obvious and there's not much to talk about, but I think it's important to note that I use the drill press for both holes to make sure that the holes are perpendicular to their surfaces. I didn't mention this earlier, but the customer wanted their initials as well as their husbands carved into the game, sort of like you'd see on a tree or a bench. I suggested carving the initials into the post since it looks most like a tree, and the customer agreed, so that's what I'm doing here. This is the first time I've ever done any carving like this, so rather than try to teach you how to do something I barely know how to do, I'm going to take this time to complain about polyurethane. In the past, I've used wipe-on polyurethane for these games and other projects because it offers a good amount of protection, it's easy to apply, and it doesn't take too long to dry to call done. I have had some issues with it in the past, but always chalked it up to my lack of knowledge or experience. This time around though, I'm not so sure that's the case. I think my problems with it this time around boil down to the figured part of the walnut. The lighter colored straight grain was super easy to get right, but I simply couldn't get the figured part correct. I literally spent 6 weeks applying, sanding, and reapplying finish. Sometimes there would be streaks from applying too much poly at once, and then when I would lightly sand it with 320 to level it out and apply a new coat in the right light, the new coat wouldn't conceal the scratches from the 320 grit, so I would sand down the wood and try again. Inevitably, I would get those streaks or dust nibs that would require sanding, so I tried 600 grit and 1000 grit, and only 1000 grit seemed to leave light enough scratches for the poly to fill in. However, I think that causes the poly to not spread out sufficiently, which makes the streaks that much more likely to occur. Well, after 3 or 4 weeks, I finally got it all right. Lately, I've been doing the finishing prior to the glue up so that if the finishing doesn't go smoothly the first time and I have to sand, I don't have to try to sand around the corner that the post makes in the game. So, after finally getting it right, I did the glue up and used the cardboard to protect the wood and the finish from the clamps. Apparently, cardboard wasn't enough this time to protect the finish because when I removed the clamps, I found that the finish had a very large dent in the top of the game. This required me to sand back down to wood on that piece and start the finishing process all over again. That's okay, right? This time I know what to do. I've done it so many times that surely I can do it without issue, right? Wrong. It took me another 2 weeks to get the finish to be passable, and that is why I'm done with polyurethane, and also why there's no footage of the finish being applied in this video. I will be moving on to Rubio Monocoat like all of the real woodworking YouTubers. Hopefully I can pull that off. Apparently that's pretty much the end of the build. I guess after all my frustrations with the finish, I forgot to record the final glue up. I apologize for that, but it does pretty much look like what you saw in an earlier step where I clamped the top to the post to the base. I think it ended up looking pretty good in the end. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.